efficiency, shared services, and consolidation, including in the area of public safety. And GovWorks, based in New Jersey, includes two of the principles from the historic 2013 merger of the two local governments that serve that community, which happens to be one of the most significant municipal mergers in the U.S. In at least a couple of decades. So I'd also note that one of the critical components of that Princeton merger was a complex and ultimately successful merger of their two police departments. So without further ado, let me introduce you to the four individuals who will serve as panelists today. Alphabetically, first of all, Paul Bishop is a senior associate at CGR. He works primarily on our government management team, where he guides municipalities on issues of efficiency and restructuring. Paul has particular expertise in public safety ops, having spent more than a decade in EMS education and having held leadership roles in a number of regional and state EMS organizations. Secondly, Chad Gerner is a GovWorks principal and former mayor of Princeton Township, New Jersey. In fact, the last pre-consolidation mayor of Princeton Township. Dr. Anton Lonston is another GovWorks principal and former chair of the study commission that developed Princeton's historic municipal restructuring plan. He also served on the police consolidation committee of that commission. And finally, Scott Sittig is an associate director here at CGR. He helps to lead our local government management team on issues of shared services, consolidation, and efficiency, and that includes studies of public safety services. So our agenda today is fourfold. First of all, to contextualize the local government fiscal challenge in terms of its impact on public safety services, to consider the challenges of changing public safety services and how they differ from other municipal services. Thirdly, to inform the list of options by exploring approaches that other communities are already taking to design more sustainable public safety services. And finally, to cover the process steps for ensuring a change effort that doesn't ignore fear and skepticism, but acknowledges it in a productive way. So one housekeeping note, we'd encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation via the chat box that's on your screen. And if for some reason you can't access that during the webinar, you can also email us directly at kbell@cgr.org. Kate Bell from our team will be monitoring that throughout the session, and we'll make sure to pass along any questions that come in through that vehicle. So thank you again for joining us. And I'd like to start by looking at the simple dollars and cents of the issue here. You know, the fiscal context in which this discussion takes place, as you all know, is stark. Local governments continue to face substantial headwinds, both in the near and long term, and states' own fiscal challenges have really reduced their ability to help. We've seen any number of reports in the last 5 or 6 years showing new data on local government deficits, sluggish revenue growth, and workforce reductions. Last year, the Government Accountability Office looked at the long-range projections, the long-range prognosis of public finance absent any change. So it's sort of a pull the steering wheel off the vehicle kind of simulation. State and local governments, already in deficit overall, are simply projected to dig a deeper hole in the coming years without management actions to remedy the situation. Now, already in 2013, as the graph shows, those aggregate state and local government deficits were the equivalent of about 2% of national GDP. That is a staggering, and I think we can all agree, unsustainable number. Of course, local governments haven't taken the challenge sitting down. Communities across the country, including many of those on the line, I would guess, have scaled back and restructured services in an effort to improve their financial sustainability. Of all major industries, since 2010, the local government sector has experienced the worst net change in employment, the worst. So that means fewer municipal employees to deliver critical local government services. And this, of course, is particularly troubling in the context of public safety, since those services tend to be local government's largest departments in terms of expenditure and in terms of staffing. And at the same time, the apparatus and capital requirements of public safety services tend to be costlier as well. And this article intro from a recent Governing Magazine issue, I think also captures the issue starkly. Public safety services, which were once insulated from the fiscal pressure, are really no longer sacrosanct. We've seen that trend intensify in the last 5 or 6 years. And the situation is creating really difficult choices for elected officials, managers, and the communities they serve. To speak a little more to those difficult choices and how communities are addressing them and what options are on the table, I'd like to turn to Chad Gerner from GovWorks to pick it up. Chad?
Thanks, Joe. As Joe had set the stage, many communities today are faced with a significant challenge, and that challenge is that in a time of declining surpluses and limited revenue options, thinking outside the box and looking at the potential for shared services, consolidation, or other ways of finding efficiency among various different departments is becoming incredibly important. Many towns today are looking at essentially two options. One, try to maintain the status quo. Continue, cutting where you can cut, reduce services, reduce staff where you can. But what we found in Princeton when I was mayor is that only lasts for so long until you reach a tipping point where you have to consider other potential options. Option two is really to look at different approaches, try to find best practices of what has occurred in other communities, try to find models and frameworks for ways in which your town or your community can work together with another community or communities in order to achieve a higher degree of efficiency and at the same time deliver a great level of service to the community. Because if we move to the next slide, what we'll see is that the public safety department in any municipality is a very emotionally sensitive department. But at the same time, it is usually one of the biggest budget items. And if we go back and we use Princeton as an example, when Princeton Township merged with Princeton Borough, the savings for the public safety or police department alone in sharing that service and merging those two departments together was $2.1 million, which represented about 70% of the total savings of consolidation. So it's a real big number typically in a lot of communities, but at the same time, there is a challenge of change, and this challenge of change brings forth with it a lot of issues in terms of public perception. Usually police and fire and emergency response units are usually the most visible function of local government. And it's important that the community is engaged throughout the process, as we'll talk about throughout this presentation here today. But with the amount of visibility that these departments have, it's important to be sensitive and be upfront and transparent in the way that you conduct any type of analyses as you go through this process.
Thanks a lot, Chad. I'd like to bring my colleague Scott Stittig into the conversation at this point. Scott, one of the things that makes each community's experience with changing services, especially public safety services, different, is that every community is different expectations, different level of services. From your experience, can you elaborate on that a little for us?
Yeah, I think I'd certainly like to reiterate that and kind of mention that for a few minutes here. As everybody on the line knows, and we certainly know from looking at many different communities, the suite of public safety services are often the most high-profile, the most highly visible services that any community has to offer. And I think Chad just touched on that a little bit. But as Joe's talking about, public safety services certainly aren't all created equal. We think about every community as being unique. Citizens are all different. They all bring different perspectives to the table. Services and service levels certainly are typically tailored to land area. They're tailored to the density, population, to service demand. Certainly there's a lot of other variables. One of the most important is community expectations. So two communities that have the same population, the same geographic size and density may have wildly different services and service levels simply because of the community demand and the expectations. So one community may want a higher level of service and have a willingness to pay for it, which is key, right? And whereas another community may not. So those differences become very important contextual factors. So even for communities with a common border that might be considered natural partners for sharing, the differences between them matter a great deal. Over time, these different community characteristics, they drive different levels of service, and more importantly, they give rise to different expectations. These expectations, as you all know, create the context for any change process or feasibility study. I think especially in cases where we're talking about sharing or merging public safety services, the reflex, I think, might be to minimize those differences. For instance, starting with how public safety services are basically the same of what, regardless maybe of what community you're in. But that's fraught with risk, and it's simply, frankly, we don't think it's true. Communities are different in public safety services. What they provide, the scale at which they provide it, their willingness to fund different types of service, their level of proactivity, so on. We can go on and on. You can't ignore those differences, and you have to acknowledge them and take them into account up front in any change process. I think in the case of shared services, the very existence of differences between communities needn't derail or upset the change efforts. In fact, many communities today actually deliver services over a wide heterogeneous areas. You can think, for instance, of a single township. It may encompass very rural areas, suburban areas, and a densely developed downtown, but it has one service, one public safety program for all of that. The community doesn't need 3 separate departments, but rather an integrated service delivery approach that acknowledges and it accounts for those important distinctions, and it allocates resources accordingly. And often they have only accounted for one of those geographies, necessitating expansion or shared service alternatives, and frankly, this becomes the starting point for the conversation. So it sounds counterintuitive, but I don't think that you can ignore the fear of change. You certainly have to acknowledge it. Perceptions that, like our police department and our fire department, deliver targeted and tailored responsive service. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes. But these sentiments create very powerful emotional context for any change effort, especially when it comes to public safety. It's important to note that they also create a sense of identity and a local presence that reinforces the tethers to the status quo. It becomes very difficult to change. It's important to recognize that skepticism and fear stem often from uncertainty. Stakeholders, especially community residents, often view potential changes as leaps of faith or rolls of the dice. They aren't necessarily inclined to entertain. It's like the old adage, the devil you know is better than the devil you don't. Especially in cases where shared services are considered, there is also the fear of losing control, of giving up decision-making authority to another entity, or relying on another entity for my community's safety and well-being. In public safety, there is also the common concern of how shared approaches might increase response distances and times. So, Joe, I think those are just some contextual factors. They're all important concerns to account for the process, or to account for in the process, not necessarily to ignore. So.
Thanks, Scott. So, Paul, I want to bring you into the conversation at this point. So this fear of the unknown, especially as it relates to concerns over potential change in public safety services, these are critical elements to acknowledge as part of the process. Let's explore this context of fear a little bit further. You know, from your experience both working on these issues at CGR and from the roles you played with on the inside of emergency service organizations, how does this context of fear of change, manifest itself in the typical change process?
Oh, fear is really a force against change. Even when efforts to explore changes in public safety are motivated by a desire to improve effectiveness and sustainability to make things better, they typically confront strong and inherently negative perceptions of change. And from the public's perspective, it's almost entirely because of this fear. So any process that doesn't acknowledge this fear and skepticism is hamstrung from the start. It can be helpful to acknowledge the changes that have occurred in the past when there's been departments that have successfully integrated new technology. And realistically, there's been changes in our lifetimes about how emergency medical services are delivered. Defibrillators are now very common across communities. And when they were first instituted, there was a lot of skepticism about whether they could be used safely, and we're now seeing that they save a lot of lives. In any study process like this, at CGR, we guide elected officials and stakeholders to do two basic things from the outset. First, acknowledge the emotional appeal of public safety services in the community. The public is emotionally connected to their public safety services for good reasons, and the fear of this change is well placed. Second, create a well-defined, interactive, and transparent process. And the transparent is very important for exploring improvement opportunities where the public can be involved and there is open, objective analysis of the options. Early engagement of the public can help mitigate that context of fear. Regardless of the option or options being explored, changes within one department, sharing services with a neighboring community, consolidating functions with another local government, these steps are critically important to the process. At the core of the fear and skepticism is what I call the power of the anecdote. As we said, when it comes to changing public safety services, the public's view is often colored by their fear of the unknown, but it's also powerfully colored by their fear of the known. A single experience with a worst-case scenario can have a significant impact on the stakeholders' perception of public safety services. A major public safety emergency, even if it happened years or decades ago, creates a powerful context for any change effort. Of course, while we acknowledge the possibility of a worst-case scenario and we plan for it, we don't actually build our baseline public safety systems at that level. In fact, in any worst-case situation, several communities are sharing their resources. They're pooling them. They're using mutual aid to be able to solve that problem. If we really built everything based on the worst-case scenario, we'd have fire stations on every corner and a police car on every street. While the worst-case scenario is not an appropriate baseline for planning general operations, change efforts have to recognize the emotional power of these experiences, how they impact the overall change process. Efforts to improve the effectiveness or sustainability of public safety services, they don't take place in a vacuum. They take place in the historical context of a community's interaction with their emergency service providers. And those powerful connections will impact the process.
Thanks a lot, Paul. Just to take a quick moment here to remind folks, we've gotten a few questions already via the chat box. I'd encourage people to submit your questions via the chat box. If for some reason you're having difficulty submitting them using that vehicle, you can email Kate Bell from our team at kbell@cgr.org, and we're going to entertain a couple of those questions as we go through the rest of the presentation, and we've set some time at the end for a more thorough Q&A. So thanks a lot, Paul. The process then and how it's set up sounds like it's really critical to success, and I'd like to go a little bit deeper on that point now with Anton Lonston from GovWorks. Anton, walk us through the process a bit and why, how that process is structured from the outset is so critical.
Great, thanks, Joe. So let's discuss the process for change here with these services. Let me start by saying that we believe successful government, local government efficiency really begins with a well-defined process. A well-defined process, especially in this case for public safety, is critical. It attracts significant public attention, and it is accompanied by a lot of passion. Furthermore, you need to have uninterrupted service, which is essential, as we all know. Back up just one step. Communities must rely on an objective and fact-based approach that evaluates a range of options. That means you don't want to start or decide early your destination, and that means, for example, you don't want to decide on a department consolidation at the outset. Why? Well, we believe it causes a bias in the direction that you take, and it compromises your process legitimacy. Your process needs to be legitimate by being open. Legitimacy also helps and provokes if you don't have legitimacy, you have the kind of skepticism and fear that would undermine your change effort. So in the white paper that Joe referred to earlier, we produced for this webinar, one of the examples we explored is in great detail, and it's a police consolidation effort that took place in Somerset County, New Jersey. It was a few years ago. It offers a valuable case in point regarding the importance of establishing an effective process. I'm going to turn it over to Scott. Scott, would you speak to that briefly, please?
Oh, I'd be happy to. You know, it was interesting a couple of years ago when we heard some folks kind of reflecting on this process, and frankly, I think what Somerset County attempted was really nothing short of historic, especially in New Jersey, and trying to bring so many communities together. But as you heard them talk about it and reflect on their process, what you kind of became pretty obvious to us that the process itself is really what undermines the intended outcome. It's not that people didn't necessarily see the benefit or not believe in the ultimate goal, but how they got there and some of the promises that were made. So let me just review maybe a couple of the key points there for those of you that may not be familiar. But Somerset County, about 2010, took on the initiative of trying to consolidate 19 different municipal police departments into one sort of regional force. Initially, it was sold, and really, quite honestly, before any analysis or study, as the possibility to save about $18 million. Well, as you can imagine, this created an extremely high set of expectations, and again, pre-analysis. Only then did information gathering and committee meetings begin in earnest, but now you're working against a set of community expectations. On top of that, importantly, I think the process lacked a robust mechanism for citizen involvement, which only fueled the public questions and the skepticism further. I think in the end, as we reflected on it, in the absence of a formal public feedback and certainly some input mechanisms for community questions, a lot of those questions and the skepticism that the community had went unanswered. And frankly, people lost confidence, especially in the large savings numbers. And certainly we learned those savings numbers kept getting revised. And the minute you start changing things from the initial expectations, the trust in the process goes pretty much out the window. So, you know, not surprisingly, by late 2012, the plan was abandoned. And frankly, it was abandoned in favor of the status quo. So a fascinating case study here to kind of speak directly to this idea of how important process is.
Thanks a lot, Scott. Anton, I want to turn it back to you for a moment just to address a question that we've gotten. It has to do with the timing of starting a process like this. How does a community know that the timing is right or wrong for a process like this to begin?
Well, the process, again, which is critical, has two key components to it. And so I would say that if we look at the first step in the process, which is the baseline phase, which is number one, and then I'm going to turn to Scott to talk about the options phase. The baseline phase really will let you speak to the first set of issues, perhaps. At the outset of any change effort, and we found this particularly in Princeton, establishing a baseline of who does what for how much, meaning how much money, and furthermore, to determine the impact and the outcome. This baseline phase is critical. Done objectively, and that's key, done objectively, it offers the point of departure for everyone to examine, to later examine alternatives, and it also provides the framework for the analysis. Scott just referred to the analysis in Somerset, about how each option stacks up against the status quo, because you're going to look at options. Options include looking at things like staffing, organizational framework, the types of services being delivered, the proactive versus reactive service, service demand levels, response times, et cetera, so that what you're looking for is a process here and a product, which is a database product, which helps you determine whether this is the right time to really look at further at the community. Now, through the affected, though the affected stakeholders here may see the viability of various options or the need for change itself from very different perspectives, and I want to make a key point here, the process ensures that a community involved shares a common set of facts about what currently exists. So the first step in our process, which is the baseline phase, helps us to see the community clearly for what exists at the present time. There's also a strong need for community forums. Sharing the baseline phase is essential to open up the lines of communication. Communicating with the public, communicating with the stakeholders. You want to reduce fear and skepticism and communicating what exists, and it's really amazing what's discovered in this process, helps to reduce the fear and skepticism. And you need to do it in a managed way, do it early and do it often. So that's phase one. Let me turn to Scott to pick up the options phase, phase two. Scott?
Yeah, I think, as Anton described, that baseline phase, as we've experienced a number of different times, that baseline phase really distills out an awful lot of important information. And it's not uncommon as you work through trying to figure out what one community has, another community has, what resources are being brought to the table. It's not uncommon for us to really uncover a range of options that distill out of that. And we think that that's really critical and important because anytime the community fears or hears maybe that there's one option and we're pursuing one option and then you begin to set some expectations around that option, all of a sudden, you know, the community's trust kind of starts to question and the skepticism picks up and they start to question, well, did you look at this option? Did you look at X option, Y option, Z option? And then without the benefit of going through an informed process and allowing the data to kind of dictate that, the community sort of feels like there's a fait accompli. You know, you're just trying to achieve a certain outcome here, and they're not included in that process. And then all those other issues we talked about, the anecdotes and the other things start to creep up, and the process gets really undermined. So, you know, from our perspective, one of the ways that we approach that is to inform the community discussion by looking at a range of options. And as I said, the baseline phase really begins to tease that out. And the continuum of those options really, it starts at one end by taking a look at, you know, what would it cost this community to keep the status quo for the foreseeable future? And then all the way to the other end, what would a fundamental re-engineering of this whole process look like of all these services, and how would that impact our community? One of the ways that we do that and how we talk, the sort of the language that we use, is looking at the concept of lenses. And that really defines the range of alternatives maybe from a minor change, and what we would consider minor is not minor to a community, but we think of it in terms of just looking at the options within one municipality to a more significant change, and that is changes that span multiple communities. So for instance, in a shared service analysis, the first lens that we might look at might examine a simple combination of two workforces. What happens in that? You got a leveling up of salaries. There's likely no other adjustment in workforce size or staff allocation. You're just kind of amalgamating two. Subsequent lenses, other ways to look at this, might examine efficiency opportunities tied to pending retirements, administrative duplication. You think of position restructurings. You think of some of the new technology that's coming out for radios and other things. That might enable workforce reduction or other changes without compromising service level and quality. And those are really key points to remember, that in any change process, what the community really cares about is what's my service quality, what are those response times, Am I still going to know the people that are walking down the beat? Am I going to be able to say hi to so-and-so when this happens? So being able to talk to those and look at those options in that context is important. So I think it might be helpful, and on the screen you'll see, let's look at a sample maybe of these range of options that we've seen in the public safety arena for the last several years. On the left-hand side, you think of within individual municipalities. We're seeing innovations around shared space. You think of back office staff and technology, such as new radios, new mobile CAD units, and the like. All of these things are happening across all of public safety agencies, especially in the area of technology. The data synergies across police, fire, EMS. The professionals on the line will understand that there's a ton of synergy there, and they're potentially very significant when it comes to sharing information on properties, violations, emergency call history, because that information becomes very valuable to the other agencies that are involved. Another lens, moving up the continuum there, is within individual municipalities. We've seen innovation in cross-training of public safety employees. So for instance, you think of maybe having your firefighting personnel conduct building inspections during non-emergency times. That actually happens in our community here. The firefighters go around and they actually are inspecting the buildings. That gives them a personal exposure to each of those buildings in the unfortunate event that they're called to deal with something of an emergency nature there. So, you know, cross-training becomes another lens through which we can look at options. Then you kind of move up the continuum. We have examples of shared and or outsourced emergency communication systems. So, for instance, here one example is Chatcom, for instance, in Georgia. And it's run by an outside third party. It's actually New Jersey-based IXP Corporation that runs it. And essentially what they set up is a consortium that provides 911 service to the communities of Sandy Springs, Johns Creek, and as of very recently, the city of Brookhaven. As you continue across the spectrum, you see that shared and or consolidated, you get into that idea of shared or consolidated emergency services. And for here, we've already touched on the idea of the police merger in Princeton or the regional contract arrangement in King County, Washington. Which is a really fascinating one when you unpack it, because it includes more than a dozen partner municipalities, but it really preserves a local identity. And what they've done out there is they've created a regional model. They have a single department head, but they have unique identifiers on their cars that allow the community to identify with their local community. And they have unique coverage areas that allow the community to get to know the people that are covering their areas. So interesting models out there on that far right-hand side, but again, you can kind of see the range of options that we look at. So I think it's still helpful to go back, and maybe I'll bring Chad in at this point, go back to that Princeton consolidation for a moment. As we reflect on that, Chad, even within that process, there were a range of options explored for police. I wonder, Chad, if you can just kind of enlighten us a little bit about some of the options that were explored there.
Sure, thanks, Scott. You know, it's good, obviously, to show some type of practical example of this, because I think the process that both Anton and Scott laid out in terms of looking at a series of lenses and having those lenses range an entire spectrum from low intensity to high intensity in terms of its conservativeness or aggressiveness.
Chad, have we lost you?
I'm sorry about that.
Okay.
So,
okay, Chad, back. Continue.
What Scott had mentioned is really critical, because when it comes to a community that's looking at a shared service operation or any type of efficiency study, it's important to take a look at a wide range of lenses, whether it be a more conservative lens to a more aggressive lens. And a practical example of that is what we had done in Princeton, where we took a look at essentially our two police departments and every other department for that matter, because we were looking at full municipal consolidation. But as it related to police, we looked at a very conservative option of just simply taking both police forces, bringing them together without any reductions in staff, and trying to find some efficiency in terms of 911 emergency call volume services and things like that. But on the more aggressive end of the scale, we looked at reducing the number of officers to about 51. And what that would do is reduce some of the middle level structure inside of the police department, and at the same time, it would allow us to still have the same number of boots on the street, which is really important for the public throughout this process. And what we ultimately ended up selecting was an option that brought us across this spectrum over a 3-year period. So we originally would begin in the first year of consolidation just by bringing the departments together, and then looking at the staffing of the departments in both municipalities, we realized that there's a high probability of attrition, that we'd be able to achieve reductions in staff that would ultimately get us to that more aggressive lens in year 3. And we looked at a 3-year implementation, going from about 60 officers down to 51, and that resulted in about a $2.1 million estimated savings amount. And the municipality is actually ahead of that as we stand here today.
Thanks, Chad. I just note for the participants, we've actually gotten a few questions during the course of the webinar already about the phase-in timeline and for the police consolidation in Princeton, along with the staffing implications of the plan that was recommended and is in the process of being implemented. So Mark and Jan and others who had submitted questions, if Chad's comments just now didn't address your questions, you'd like more information, certainly feel free to submit a follow-up. But what I'd like to do at this point to wrap this discussion on process is go back to the basic issue of community fear and skepticism when it comes to changing public safety services. And as we noted earlier, I think any process that ignores this fear and skepticism does so at its own peril. Effective efforts really acknowledge it instead of minimizing it. So aside from a good baseline and options phase, and I'd like your thoughts on this, Anton, how can communities best acknowledge rather than minimize this skepticism and fear?
Well, it seems kind of trite to say this, but communication information is critical. We went in with the belief that an informed resident or citizen or stakeholder in the change process is the best consumer. And an engaged and informed consumer is a lot less likely to make a decision solely on the basis of that skepticism and fear once you acknowledge it, once you look at it. So we found that, and we believe this going in, that they based on good information. Well, I want to briefly mention 4 things that we feel created a robust engagement effort to counteract skepticism and fear. The first is we had a website that was updated in real time with information and data on the study process. And it was a fabulous website, I believe, and it also asked the community for feedback and questions on we used again in real time. The second was we had a series of public forums and in-home meetings throughout the process, and we started right at the very beginning, not just at the end. Participation throughout the entire process. The third was that we had regular public or open meetings of the study session, and they were really, in some respects, more like town hall meetings. And the fourth is that we had a very active community engagement subcommittee as part of the commission that conducted approximately 70 sessions over a 1-year span in places like the Senior Center, the Board of Education, faith institutions, neighborhood groups, neighborhood associations, and lots of them in residence homes, in their living rooms. Inform the public, and equally as important, we wanted to be informed by the public as well. So we wanted to give and we wanted to receive. Now, especially on the issue of public safety, and that is the police and the public engagement really helped to elicit key concerns about potential changes that, that might come out of the commission that we could respond to and they could respond to. Let me turn it over to Paul, because he has a couple of thoughts on this one as well. Paul?
This is so important because improving efficiency and effectiveness is not just about dollars and cents. For public safety, community engagement is critical to identifying and accounting for the public sense of what constitutes an acceptable level of service, what makes it an improvement over that current level. Is the public willing to pay more to improve service levels? We talked earlier about fear, and in some cases communities say it's worth it to me to pay that little bit extra to sleep better at night. Conversely, in order to generate savings, is the public willing to reduce certain services that do not involve basic reactive law enforcement? You can't answer these questions without engagement. Some communities we work in, the police officers go out and they'll open a car if somebody has locked their keys in it. In other cases, they refer that to a local service station to perform. Beyond the public stakeholders, we also have to recognize the importance of engaging the employees and labor union stakeholders. Their participation can be critical to an effective process, and they typically share many of the same fears and skepticism that the public brings to this type of effort. You can't ignore that. And finally, the public safety chiefs play a very important role. If your police chief or your fire chief or the head of EMS is out in the public saying this plan is not going to work, you're going to be working uphill. You need to get their buy-in. You need to work with them throughout this process to make sure that whatever change is being suggested is reasonable on their professional expertise, and frankly that they can back that up, that they're not just saying, yeah, that's what we need to do, but they have some statistics to show it or some industry standards to back up their suggestions.
Thanks, Paul. Thank you, Anton, for the discussion of process. There are three other elements that are raised in the white paper regarding effective process management that I just want to briefly speak to. We're not going to go into, we don't have time to go into detail on the call today. But first of all, a process champion is vital, someone or some body like a study committee or commission whose fidelity is to the process overall rather than to a specific outcome. And in our experience, efforts that lack such a body or an individual can really lose momentum and legitimacy in the community. We talked about the risks of that, especially when we're dealing with changes in public safety services. The second key element is setting the right tone from the very beginning of the process. And the process champion has a real responsibility in this. Establishing a study environment where the effort isn't being done to the departments without their involvement, nor is it establishing a predetermined outcome as a fait accompli. That if the effort is going to be truly objective and data-driven, it's much more likely to be successful regardless of what the outcome is. And finally, outside expertise can make a huge difference. An independent third party can help to remove some of that, much of that perceived bias from the process, both in the analysis and in the interface with the larger community. And removing any perceived bias is critically important in a context where fear and skepticism are present. So I just wanted to reinforce those other 3 points. Again, they're discussed in more detail in the white paper, and if you're interested in reading more about them, I'd encourage you to look at the white paper on the website. So in our last few minutes then, before we do a little Q&A, I'd like to consider what happens after implementation. We spent a lot of time talking about how you navigate that change process, but once you get to and beyond the finish line, how do we maximize the potential for success? And for a few quick points, Anton, I'd like to start with you on this issue.
Great, thank you. The shift from planning and studying to administering, I want to mention 2 points that I felt were very, very critical. And the first one is, simply stated, shared leadership. Shared services for any organization, public safety particularly, I think, require an active commitment, and I would actually use the word ownership from all participating governments and individuals within it. The function can't be one government's project and another simply goes along. You really need to have leadership that is committed, whether it's 2 communities or 3, or even within 1, and you're combining some operations. So the leadership challenge that we have is to bring together individuals with a commitment and a common ownership. So that's one. That also includes issues around different cultures, dealing with different cultures, and the leadership of those organizations. And we can come back to that issue of cultures in a minute if we want. Secondly, and I think that this is equally as important, is that you need to have, and we've already said this transparency. This transparency and trust and shared expectations. In order to do that, and I've already said this a couple of times, open communication, support, and ongoing respect among the partners is essential. A written contract or a vote isn't enough. And ensuring communication and trust that's shared and shared expectations, it isn't a one-time thing. It goes on, and it has to be nurtured throughout implementation by all of the leadership in the community. Let me turn to Paul for some comments on performance measurement.
There's another guideline to follow during implementation, and that's monitoring, measuring, and making changes. Establishing performance benchmarks at the outset and monitoring progress against measurable objectives not only contributes to service quality, but permits and supports the service responsiveness that can help allay new waves of skepticism or fear of change. If there was a promise for a specific response or service level, it should be measured, the results should be shared so people can decide is the process working the direction we want it to be. Joe?
Thanks, Paul. Thank you, Anton, and to Chad and Scott for a great discussion on what I think is a critically important issue. Before we open it to questions, and Anton, just a minute or two ago, you actually previewed one of the questions we've gotten about culture, so I'll hold that. That'll be the first one I throw out to you. But before we do open it to questions, I just want to review some key takeaways here for the group. Local governments remain under significant budgetary stress, and public safety services are certainly feeling the squeeze of that fiscal pressure like they haven't in at least a couple of generations. The challenge of creating positive change in public safety services is unique among local government functions, primarily because of the fear and skepticism that typically surrounds changes in emergency services. Thirdly, this fear and skepticism is tied not only to the essential nature of these services, but that emotional tie, that emotional connection that communities and residents have to them. And I think that really raises the implementation challenge that much higher for any change in public safety services. Fourth, acknowledging and engaging those fears and that skepticism through an objective, unbiased process of data collection and analysis of options can help to diffuse, in our experience certainly not eliminate, but at least diffuse those fears and that skepticism to a manageable level, to a degree where change is possible. And finally, related to that, it can be extremely helpful to have a robust public engagement effort built. In our experience, that's critical to any change process in government generally, but in public safety services in particular. And that is whether we're just exploring options or actually implementing. I think that the responsibility to be transparent and open and communicate and engage with the broader community doesn't end when we have a memorandum of agreement or we have a service contract between municipalities. It really has to be sustained throughout the implementation process. Transparency, openness, and communication are key. So with that, I'd like to move on to a few questions that came in. Anton and Paul, I'm actually going to throw the first one to you. And as I said, Anton, you previewed this. It has to do with culture. And the question is, how does a community or a commission address merging two potentially different organizational cultures, especially when we're talking about public safety services?
Great. The first thing is, and it goes back to something said earlier, you have to acknowledge the fact that each organization will have its own unique elements to its culture, particularly as you look at enforcement agencies. At least that's my view in looking at a lot of them. And you get into issues of what's the enforcement and what are the training procedures and how do you deal with conflict and how do you, what's the hierarchy of the organization, et cetera. And one of the things that is really troubling, that communities tend to develop some mischief about the cultures of organizations, and the anecdotes in the community feed that. The anecdotes feed things about how enforcement takes place with youth, for example, or minorities, for example. And acknowledging and getting at the basis in the organization and in the community is very critical. So without going into a lot of detail about it, acknowledge it, that it does exist, that you need to work to bring the different cultures together, and secondly, that you really do need to have an understanding, a clear understanding, and sometimes help is needed with this. Sometimes outside help is needed to understand the uniquenesses, the differences, and the similarities as well. Let me turn it over to Paul, because I could keep going.
Paul, you have some thoughts on this?
Sure. On that last point, is the similarities is very important. Although fire departments and police departments might have different patches on their shoulders, slightly different color uniforms, or a different vehicle they drive, they really would have a common mission. So law enforcement officers really speak to the protect and the serve, and you can draw on that common mission as you're trying to help them identify the cultural issues and bring them together. So focusing on the common areas, the things that are similar, the cultures of the departments change over time, and you can refer them back to a time when there was a different chief and things were slightly different then, and we're really just looking at trying to move towards a different end state.
Thanks, Paul. We have about 4 minutes left here, and I do have a few other questions. The first one actually just came in via the web chat. We have a attendee asking for some feedback on the concept of converting separate police and fire departments into a single public safety department. I think, Paul, you're probably best positioned to respond to this.
Sure. The interesting answer to that is there's one state that seems to do this the most often, and that's Michigan. And there's a lot of departments in Michigan that have done that successfully and have had that as success for 30, 40 years. They tend to be small cities or large townships that do that, where you can leverage the fact that fire services are not used very often, but when they are, they need to be deployed quickly, and there's that special services. Interestingly, there haven't been a lot of conversions to that in recent years, and there have been a few where a joint public safety department has split apart back into a police department and a fire department. Both disciplines have become increasingly specialized in their training, and as they have accreditation, the training levels go up. It's not something that can't be done, but it requires a kind of a special breed of person that's willing to undertake both the law enforcement and fire service training.
Thanks, Paul. And Scott, I'm going to throw the next question to you. I'm going to have you deal with a very complicated concept in about 30 seconds if you can, and it's the issue of turf. And the basic question is, how do we get an agency to look at changing itself, or multiple agencies to start talking when it might mean turf gets stepped on?
Yeah, that's a fun softball to end here. But the idea of trying to get across turf, there's two different approaches that you can take, and I think one is a strengths-based approach, and one is a deficit-based approach. You think about it maybe in the terms of strategic planning, but the idea there is, and it comes out in our baseline report a lot, what are the areas of commonality? What are the two departments already doing? Where are their strengths? And what are they already doing that kind of crosses over and collaboratively they could do better together than maybe they could do alone, or that they're already doing well? And so we think about identifying areas of commonality, and then, at least in the eyes of the community, you begin to build this dialogue around the fact that we're already doing a lot of the same things. What would be the next logical step? And so turf becomes less important in the eyes of the community, but certainly you still got to deal with some of those things within the eyes of the department itself and the professional folks that are doing that job. So there you get into the idea of deficits. What isn't our department able to do because of resources, limited staffing, and whatnot, that we could potentially expand and do better together because we can multiply and deploy those resources. So you can begin the conversation from two different perspectives and really try to get to the same type of an outcome. There's a lot more that could be said there, and I know we're running short on time, but that's just two quick ways to think about it.
Thanks a lot, Scott. And just before we wrap, I want to note, want to thank Jennifer Gutman from IXP Corp, who texted that she's on the call. We mentioned the Chatcom outsourced 911 example from Georgia, which is a very innovative model, earlier in the call. To the extent that there are questions on that, we'd be happy to connect anybody that's interested that wants to either email us directly or reach out to IXP. So thanks, Jennifer, for letting us know. So I just want to thank all the attendees and presenters today. Please don't hesitate to keep sending your questions and comments to us. You can do so after the webinar to kbell@cgr.org. We'll do our best to get you answers and information. We'd be happy to discuss any of these issues further with you and your communities. As a reminder, we will load the full audio and video of this webinar on the website at cgr.org/gov-efficiency over the next few days. And we hope you'll join us for our next Local Government Playbook webinar, which will be held later this year. We'll make sure that all of you see those details when they are finalized. So for all of us at CGR and at GovWorks, thank you very much for participating in the conversation today, and have a wonderful afternoon.